I'm going to talk with Shawn later in our interview about just some of the general topics about the prosecutor's office, but let's start out with, earlier last week you had announced a decision, your decision, not to charge the 3 Pasco police officers in the death of Anthony Zambrano. Anybody who doesn't live under a rock has seen that video across the country. So, Shawn, if you would please tell us the basis of your decision. How did you come to the conclusion not to charge the officers?
Like with any case, especially a large case that's going to capture a lot of attention, but really with any major crime case, any homicide case, we typically review the facts of the case, the initial case file. We decide who should be assigned to that case if I choose not to take it myself. And as in this case, obviously we knew that this was going to be a large-scale investigation. We didn't get the reports until the latter part of May. So one of the first things that we did upon review is looking at what case assignments we would do, assign various attorneys in my office to review various witness statements, kind of come back together, and then of course the evaluation part, looking at the legal, what does the law say we need to do in our evaluation. And I know that that's really caught a lot of people's attention because people have interpreted my decision as saying, hey, this was a perfectly executed case, there could not be any other options. But really the law tells us that what we need to focus on is, given all of the information that was available to the officers, given the totality of all the witnesses that were there, also giving their account of what they observed, what they heard, what they saw. When we measure all of that information together, then the law asks us to review whether or not the officers exercised good faith. In other words, was their use of force with a good faith basis, that their use of force was justifiable under the law, under the section that authorizes law enforcement to use such lethal force. And then what I've tried to focus on for individuals, because there's been a lot of talk about the issue of whether or not you could prove malice. I've really tried to focus on just the good faith issue, because I recognize some of the concerns people have is that, you know, malice could be difficult to prove or whatnot. So what I tried to do is narrow my review to the good faith. Obviously we have to consider, because that's what I'm tasked with, is following the law. I need to consider the malice element, but to me, I wanted to understand, was there a reasonable basis for these officers, given the stress or the circumstance of this situation as it evolved, was their use of force reasonable under their circumstances, and was it with a good faith effort? The law says even if their decision was unreasonable, or if it later turned out that it was maybe not the best decision, or if it was even unreasonable, but if they had a good faith basis to believe that everything that they were experiencing and they truly thought that their use of force was justified, then that's what the law says for me to do, is that I shall not hold them criminally liable. That's what the statute says. Very seldom do we see statutes that say shall not, or use that shall language. But this statute does. And I think when we look at the legislative intent of that, is we have to consider, why would our legislature do that? And I think it's because they've recognized that we ask the men and women of law enforcement to put themselves into difficult situations. Sometimes those officers are put into situations where they may not have all the best information available, but they have to make split-second decisions. Life and death decisions are made within a second. And when we evaluate that, I think the legislature contemplated that as well and made it. So it's not quite the same standard as anybody else. But I think one of the things that we need to also consider with this case is just use of self-defense. You know, people are allowed to use self-defense, and in a similar standard, if people feel reasonably threatened and they act based on those threats and their perceptions, we apply a similar evaluation for those. But they don't have the same statute that basically says shall not be criminally liable. But we still have to evaluate. We still have to evaluate all the facts and circumstances to determine whether or not that's a reasonable.
So the video, as you know, went viral, and a lot of people who looked at the video did not have all of the information, all of the investigative information from the Special Investigative Unit to go on like you did. But if they look at that, a lot of people have questioned, well, goodness, couldn't the officers have done something else? 3 officers to subdue 1 man. And so they they're confused about that, and then on top of that, they would be confused about the good faith.
Right.
I mean, I understand the malice, but the good faith.
Yeah.
So how do you reckon with that?
So really what the good faith means is it means, did the officers really believe when they used that lethal force, did they believe that such use of force would be justified under the statute? And one of the things to help us evaluate that is what took place from the moment that the first officer arrived on scene. In fact, we have to go back to even before officers arrived on scene. We have a few witnesses that were able to articulate what was going on. The 911 caller, he described this person as being under the influence of drugs. He's throwing rocks at cars. He hit his truck. And so that's why this caller called in particular, is because his truck was hit. And so that triggered a response from a lot of people. A lot of people were looking at this. As it says, as you go through the case file, you see that people were honking their horns. Some of the witnesses were saying, hey, they were trying to get the officer's attention. This same officer had driven through, I guess, the area before the call even came out, didn't see anything. So he turned around once dispatch advised that, hey, there's this disturbance going on. He turned around and was able to pull into the lot and then later located him. So one of the things that we have to evaluate is what took place, not just before, but what were the observations from these other witnesses that aren't even members of law enforcement. This first officer arrived on scene. Many witnesses that were interviewed by the SIU unit went out and they got their statements, and they're basically saying this individual had threatened the officer. He was trying to throw rocks at the officer. The officer was described as kind of a calming manner, waving his hands down, just kind of talk this person down, trying to communicate with him. This is long before the officer even pulled his taser out. Now the witnesses eventually say this was kind of a deteriorating situation. Eventually the officer had to draw his taser once the rocks began to be thrown at him and the officer felt concerned. But again, that's a slow, progressive. Now I say slow, but really this is happening very short. This whole segment from the time the officer arrived to when the final shots were fired, that's 6 minutes. So when I say slow, I mean immediately the officer just didn't get out of his car, draw his gun and decide, hey, I'm going to subdue this person. He tried to do everything he could to communicate, and that's repeated by several witnesses. The officer eventually calls out for help. Other officers hear that a taser's been deployed. You can see that on one of the videos as Officer Flanagan's rising. You can see that Mr. Zambrano appears to be under the effects of a taser. His left side is immobilized. Only later did we find out that's where the probes were at, so it only would immobilize that part of the body. What you can see in the video, though, from that officer video pulling up, you see that he's still armed with a rock. You see that he has another rock that he's able to throw. And you actually see him begin to throw what appears to be that rock.
And you see that half of his body is immobilized?
You can see that his left arm, when the officer pulls up, you can see that his left arm is not moving. It looks like he's kind of ducking down. And so that's the appearance of someone that would be under the effects of the taser, and that's kind of supported by what the officer had said as well as other people.
Now, I've seen a few things on television, but it's my understanding that normally once you get hit by a taser, I've seen tasers tested on military personnel, and it doesn't matter where it hits you. The tasers I've seen on TV, when people are hit, they go down like that.
That is the desired effect, and that is why a taser is so effective. In fact, one of the paramedics that arrived on scene said that he's only seen one other time where a taser didn't have the desired effect of bringing a person to the ground. And so a taser is a very effective, less lethal alternative. In fact, that's been part of the question throughout this whole process, is that, well, wait a minute, some witnesses didn't even realize that he had been tasered. And so that's what's, it's been a process of gathering all those witness statements. So let's see what these witnesses were able to see and why they might not have seen that other thing. Because as we all know, this is a very crowded intersection at the end of the day. People are going to be somewhat limited in what they can see, but when we put all those statements together, we're able to really piece together what was going on. And so for our evaluation, Christine, as you had asked, is we're looking at what did these officers do, what were they experiencing, what did the other witnesses, people that have no involvement with law enforcement, what are their observations? One lady witness described seeing the officer dealing with Zambrano, trying to get him under control. She described it as such an out-of-control situation. She contemplated running him over with the car to help the officer. So that is a drastic statement from a lay witness of saying, what is that person seeing? Why is she so concerned for the officer's safety? Another witness that was there across the street with his family, He was actually going to the aid of the officer before the other officers arrived. So when the one officer is dealing with this guy by himself, he was actually willing, and I appreciate that. That says something about our community. This witness was willing to potentially jeopardize his own safety because of what he saw, what his wife saw, that this officer was in need of help. He was in the process of going across the street to give aid, and then he heard the sirens and realized, okay, great, the help is on the way. And that's when Officer Flanagan arrived. So from that point on, as you could see what appears to be the taser as supported by the other witnesses. The other witnesses also talk about how Zambrano attempted to grab the taser. In other words, he's grabbing the taser probes, and he was able to remove some of them. One of the important pieces of the video, because I recognize the initial videos that I saw, you know, that's kind of concerning because it's like, wait a minute, this is just a moment in time before the shots are fired. So now we back up and we got the benefit. One witness in particular was also in the Fiesta Foods parking lot. He captured the moments that occurred right after Officer Flanagan arrived. Officer Flanagan answers the question that many people have, and witness corroborate this too, is that why didn't he try to tackle him? Well, Flanagan actually did. As soon as he got out of the car, he was trying to assess the situation. He thought he had a moment where Zambrano was bending over trying to grab additional rocks. That's when Flanagan ran in to try to tackle him. But then you capture in that Mendoza video that came out, you see Zambrano with a big rock over his head in one hand chasing the officer. You actually hear the couple kind of laughing because they might have thought this appeared kind of funny because it probably didn't set in that, hey, this is a real situation. And judging by their comments on the video later, they realized, hey, this is getting real. And so you see that officer fleeing from Zambrano as he's running with that rock. Well, soon after that, which you don't capture on the video, but based on the statements, as a rock was thrown, that Officer Flanagan responded with a taser shot to Zambrano. He describes one of those taser probes hit him in the head. The other one went over his head because Zambrano ducked down at the time of the deployment. So even after getting hit in the head with a taser probe, which was going to cause significant pain to a person that's not up on any kind of narcotics or drugs, that's going to have a response of, oh my gosh, this is getting real, I'm going to subdue. But that just continued. Several witnesses described as the officers got there, he almost seemed to be more empowered. You see on the video later how he has two rocks in his hands and he kind of brings them up. And one witness has described it as kind of a field goal kind of situation. Well, to know what that witness is seeing, we actually were able to capture that on the Mendoza video, and you could kind of put those pieces together and see from that witness's vantage point how it might look like he's doing a field goal. That witness wasn't able to see that there was rocks in the hand because he was kind of looking at him from behind. But we put all of those statements together to really assemble what is going on here. And after reviewing that, and after the officers, you could hear it in their voice when they call out, hey, cover code 3, he's throwing rocks at us, cover code 3. That's a call for help that does not come out on law enforcement channels very often. That's basically a call that says, we need you to get here now. Lights and siren, get here now, we need help. It was shortly after that call that you hear, we're going to have to exceed force here shortly, meaning they've exhausted all the means. The two officers, Alanese and Flanagan, that had their tasers, those had been exhausted. They were not working. They were not having the desired effect, which everybody wants, is to bring it to an end without anything escalating. That didn't work. The third officer to arrive, he describes seeing that as soon as he gets out of his car, he sees that a taser is on the ground, meaning, okay, the officers have already tried that. They've thrown the taser down. Officer Alanese and both Officer Flanagan now are kind of pointing in his direction, so he was concerned because he's in the middle of this crossfire. So they realized that whatever was going on the moments before he arrived, it was serious because now both officers have both of their firearms pointed at Zambrano. That's when Wright took a position just off to the side of the car. You can't see it on the video camera, but what you can see is shortly after that large object, it's called a rock. It's identified in police reports as a piece of concrete. It's about a 4.96 pound piece of concrete that was thrown. Officer Alanese moved out of the way, but because of the line of direction, when he moved out of the way, that kind of brought it close to Wright. And that's where you see that initial volley of fire. You see Officer Wright take 2 shots in front of the video car, or in front of the dash camera of Flanagan's car, and then Officer Flanagan almost immediately fires 3 shots. The officer stopped at that point. So the question becomes, if lethal force was justified in that situation, a lot of people have been asking, well, what about the 17 shots? 2 shots were fired by Officer Wright and 3 shots were fired at this point in time by Officer Flanagan. It had no effect. Several witnesses said, oh my gosh, I thought they shot him in the back. They thought he had been shot and he's not stopping. What later was able to be turned out by both the first autopsy and the second autopsy, the injuries are consistent. The injury that Zambrano sustained to his upper right arm is likely the injury that caused the dropping of the blood through the crosswalk. So we know he was hit. But the other important thing about that is both of those autopsy reports showed that it entered the back side of the arm, the outer part of the arm, exited the front part of the arm, and then went into his chest. That tells us that, consistent with what witnesses had seen about how Zambrano was turning at the time, as well as from where the officer was located, that the officer fired his shots, at least one of those shots, as he was turned or turning. So looking at this, looking at the use of force, the fact that the officer stopped, once he had completely turned around and the officers are able to perceive that, hey, he's turned around, he's no longer presenting an immediate threat to us, they stopped. They keep their weapons out. They kept their weapons out and they followed him. But if you follow the video as well as the witness statements, I think one of the witness statements was interesting from the same individual that had said he wanted to help the officer. He's describing Zambrano as kind of turning around, kind of halfways with the rock in the one hand, kind of looking back at the officers, keeping an eye on them, thinking that, hey, they're going to be pursuing me. He gets to the crosswalk and then that's when he heads down the sidewalk. So the final sequence, so we have 5 shots that have been fired at this point, and now the remaining shots, when you break it up by officer, if you look at the video, all the officers had perceived the threat at pretty much the same time, because you see simultaneous fire. So Officer Flanagan fires 6 rounds, Officer Wright fires 5 rounds, and then Officer Alanese fired the 1 round. And that was the only round that was actually being able to be identified through the forensic process as being the wound that hit him in the side of the buttocks, the left buttock, and the bullet was actually recovered from the right. Why is that important? It's important because all this early release of photos, a 2-dimensional photograph suggesting that he was shot in the back, has now been refuted, not just with the first autopsy, but also with the second autopsy that was requested at the family's request. So again, that has been able to reaffirm the information that we're able to gather from all these witnesses, able to gather from the officer statements, because remember, a lot of criticism was that, hey, these officers didn't give statements until several months after. Well, they didn't even complete the last citizen statement until a month and a half after this event as well. So, I mean, the investigation was still going, and I recognize the concern for that, but even after the officers gave their statements, they didn't have the benefit of all this other evidence, and those officers' statements had to be upheld against all those witnesses. So in our review, nothing that the officers had said was directly refuted by any of the other witnesses. Some people had a different perception. Some people thought that he appeared to be shot in the back. Again, that's the importance of that forensic piece to this that could kind of answer some of those questions. So when we look at this and we look at the totality of everything, whether or not those officers were an immediate threat, we got to put ourselves in the position of those officers, all the steps that they took to try to bring him under control, and was it those officers' good faith belief that when he turned around again, just like they described the way his stance was, the motion of his hand and the object of the rock, they all described that as being a kind of a pre-threat indicator or an attempt to throw that rock. Just like Officer Alanese had seen so many times before, because Officer Alanese was able to observe him more than any of the other 2 officers. So his real description is that, hey, this is the same stance, same position he's taken as he's done before to throw it. So when we evaluate this from our office's viewpoint, I'm not looking at could there be other alternatives, what other options could have been available. I'm simply focused and tasked, and this is what the law requires of me, is can it be shown that these officers did not have a good faith belief that their actions were appropriate. And that's what brings us to the conclusion that we ultimately, it was my decision, but this was basically a consensus in the office, is that after we consider all of those facts, the totality of this case, the shooting was determined to be justified.
You've painted quite a picture for us, and I think that you have expanded what people knew about it. A lot of people listening may not have known these kinds of details. So we're going to take a break here. We'll be back. We've got Shawn Sant is my guest. He is the prosecuting attorney for Franklin County. Last week he shared his decision on not charging the 3 officers in Pasco with the shooting death of Antonio Zambrano. Now, Mr. Sant has just explained a lot of the background of what was going on during those 6 minutes, and you have been praised, Shawn, for your willingness and openness to talk about all of the details now that the decision has been made. I mean, there was recently even an editorial in the paper about that. So that brings me to, I don't understand why you would not agree to a coroner's inquest when simply what it does is provide another avenue to get more information out there to people. Information is like so powerful. Why do you not support that?
No, it's a good question. I remember back early on in this case, long before we ever got details of the case, before we got the SIU report, there was discussion that, you know, this inquest might be an option for us. In other words, to flesh out additional information. But the important part to remember about an inquest is what is the role of the inquest? The inquest is designed to determine the cause and manner of death, who might be responsible, and identify how the person died. Those questions were answered a long time ago. What this comes down to is now a legal question of whether or not, based on all these facts and circumstances, are we going to obtain any additional information? This is the same response that we've heard from the attorneys representing the family members, all the other victims, or family members of murder victims or homicide victims. People that have suffered violent crimes. We meet with the families and we talk about it, and their family raised the question of whether or not an inquest should be done, and they said no, they don't want an inquest. They want to have the results here so that they can move forward with their civil case, and that's something that can be handled separately. But directly to the issue of an inquest, the question is, what additional information could be yielded? And that's really what it is. It's a tool sometimes that prosecutors may use. It's been used before in cases of self-defense where maybe it's a close call. The prosecutor feels that, you know what, I don't want to be the one making the decision here. Let's do an inquest and get some additional information. But one of the important things to remember is that this was a very thorough investigation. A lot of witnesses participated, and there's videos from multiple angles, multiple people. Very seldom have we ever had a homicide case that was captured by the number of witnesses, the eyewitnesses that were able to see the scene, number of videos. And so the question becomes, is that really the part for an inquest to do? Now, the one thing that an inquest can address is the issue of transparency. And I think that criticism is answered by the fact that we chose, even though it was detrimental, because I did not want to release documents. I shared that in multiple press briefings before. I thought that if we were to release the materials before a decision or before the inquest, it would impact potentially the case. But I have to follow the law. That's what I have been tasked to do. That's what I take an oath of office to do, is uphold and support the Constitution of our state, as well as the statutes of Washington State. And part of those statutes are the Public Records Act. When we received that, we complied with it. We were able to use the help of state agencies that provided assistance to us so we could get the information out. So the question is, wouldn't this be more transparent to have an inquest? Well, we don't anticipate there being any new information from the inquest. Simply drawing in all these witnesses and have them basically lay out what they've already given as a recorded interview and statement to law enforcement. If they're just coming in for the sole purpose of repeating what they've already provided to law enforcement, that's not going to yield
I guess I see it more as simply transparency for the public. So the public has a chance to hear it all again versus going and reading it. Now, the other thing that's going to happen is that the governor has asked the Attorney General to review your decision. What do you think about that?
Like I said in our release, we were asked to comment on that. You know, I think it's important for the public, I guess, in the sense that they know that there's going to be a second review by the Attorney General's office. The governor has that authority. He's exercised it. He's asked the AG to review the case. Again, that goes back to whether or not an inquest is really relevant, because if you have that second review, that's going to be examining all the same facts and information that we've reviewed. It seems like that is going to be the check and balance. And so the question of transparency, I think, from the standpoint of a lot of people have asked from the very beginning, they thought that, oh, I'm too close, I need to be removed from the case. Their basis for removing me from the case would essentially remove me from any criminal case, because it involves law enforcement referrals. Folks in law enforcement refer cases to our office. We have to evaluate that evidence and make decisions. We do that all the time. We do it on hundreds of cases, if not thousands a year. So if I was going to step back because there was a perceived conflict, then I'd have to do that on every case. And so we think that the transparency prong has been answered by us releasing all of the information. People could look at those witness statements, they could look at the evidence, and I guess make a decision for themselves. But that wasn't the purpose of it. The purpose of it was simply to comply with the law and to be transparent.
One question to bring up, and it might be the elephant in the room question, it has been brought to our attention from a number of sources, and I'm just going to throw it out there, and you can answer this as best you can. We've seen similar, this has to do with federal intervention, whether it's Baltimore or other places. To be blunt, do you feel like Governor Inslee is throwing the Franklin County judicial process and legal process? Do you feel like you're being thrown under the bus by this? Second, questioning integrity and the SIU investigation?
I think the governor has a different set of concerns, probably much different than mine. I don't make charging decisions based on polls. I have to make a charging decision based upon what the evidence shows, what the evidence supports, and I have to consider all of those facts in my decision-making process. The governor is not tasked with making a charging decision. He's simply tasked of trying to make sure that he's appealing to individuals that have called for his help. My understanding is there's been several requests from many groups that have reached out to the governor's office previously. The governor has said, you know, they're going to let the local authorities move forward with the case and complete it before considering those other options. So I guess he's been consistent for what he earlier said, but I do have to wonder, I don't know if he's exercised that authority on any of the other cases that have happened throughout the state. I don't know if that's because it hasn't reached the national or international attention that this case might have brought. Certainly, I'm all in favor of being transparent. We've been transparent in this process, and I welcome the second review because I'm confident that he's got good attorneys in the Attorney General's office, and I'm confident that they're going to come up with the same conclusions.
All right, hey, I wanted to ask you a couple of other, all right, we're going to take a break here.
We'll take a quick break, and you can come right back with that question.
All right. Welcome back. My guest is Shawn Sant, prosecutor for Franklin County. I really wanted to ask you just a couple of questions about the prosecutor's office in general. Like, what is the #1 type of criminal case that the office, your office covers?
What we have been seeing most recently is just I mean, it's a high number of methamphetamine cases. I mean, methamphetamine continues to plague our community, and unfortunately that was a big factor. In fact, I'd probably say that was the main factor of what led to Mr. Zambrano's case, was because of the high concentration of meth that he had in his system at the time that this incident. In addition to the blood sugar issue, that was kind of a competing medical emergency, so to speak, but the methamphetamine, it really makes people violent. We've consulted with doctors, our toxicologists at the state lab. I mean, its effects are phenomenal of what it will do. It will change a person to where the person you see under methamphetamine is not the person that would be sober.
So are we talking about the production of it, distribution of it, use of it? What are you prosecuting?
Yeah, mostly what we end up getting is either the use, local level, smaller quantities, but we also do see some larger quantities that people get caught with. Usually it's at the time of arrest for something else. That's usually how this comes about, is they're doing something else. They have warrants. And
do you think it impacts their behavior?
Oh, absolutely.
And that's why they are being arrested, or that's why they commit a crime?
Really, it's a combination of both. We see people that commit burglaries. Our burglary numbers are up, and usually that's because people are trying to support a habit. So it's a complicated situation, because if we don't treat, and that's the thing, even if we have additional treatment beds, if we have additional treatment agencies out there, you can't, you could lead the horse to water, but you can't make him drink, and that's certainly true for drug intervention. People have tried, not necessarily on this case that we've talked about, but on other cases, they have tried to get their family members into treatment. Sometimes it works for a while, but eventually they fade off and they start using again. It's an ongoing problem. It's an epidemic.
Yeah.
And you know, if there's anything that we could do within our community to reduce the level of drug use, especially methamphetamine, it would have a great impact on our community.
All right, one other question.
Yeah.
We've talked about immigration a lot on this program, and one of the things that comes up, and so I want to get your opinion on this, is that there is a disproportionate number of crimes committed in Franklin County or Pasco, for example, by illegals, by people who are undocumented. Is that true?
That's a difficult question for us because we don't have that information. We don't look at one's immigration status when they get referred to our office as a crime. We evaluate the case based on the information in that case file. So typically we don't come across that. Sometimes we will come across information that might be shared. Law enforcement might have previous contacts with a person that may have been previously deported. The recent homicide that we had, the double homicide in Connell, information was provided to us that the person had been deported back in 2014. But that's probably that's not the norm. We usually don't find out about one's immigration status, and so it's really not a factor for us. What we're simply doing is trying to base decisions based on the violations of the state law, and hopefully the Fed will handle their issue with the immigration part of it.
All right, so I don't get the question answered. We're gonna keep looking for that. Not that you couldn't answer it. I don't mean that this is not the source to answer that question, but it keeps coming up, and I'm just really curious about it. Shawn Sant, thank you so much for joining us and really kind of explaining some of the background of the decision. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah.